but we have a very special invited guest who has agreed to offer our keynote address. And I believe her words are much more powerful, much more salient than what I could ever offer this group today. Her bio does appear in the program, but it's so powerful, I'd like to read it to you once again. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Dr. Sara Goldrick-Rab, who will be speaking to us today about addressing students' needs with a culture of caring. Dr. Goldrick-Rab is a professor of sociology and medicine at Temple University and president and founder of the Hope Center for College Community and Justice in Philadelphia. She is also the chief strategy officer for Emergency Aid at Equity, a student financial success and emergency aid company, and she founded Believe in Students, a nonprofit distributing emergency aid. Her innovative research on college students' basic needs sparked the national #RealCollege movement and legislation to address food and housing insecurity. Ranked in the top 10 among education scholars according to Education Week, she is also a Carnegie Fellow. In 2016, Politico magazine named her one of the top 50 Americans shaping politics. Sara's book, Paying the Price, College Costs, Financial Aid, and the Betrayal of the American Dream, was featured by The Daily Show with Trevor Noah and awarded the $100,000 Groyamir Prize, which she donated to student emergency aid. Based on her extensive research, she documents the consequences for students and colleges and describes approaches for addressing these challenges with a culture of caring. This includes a multi-level approach to shifting both practice and policy, and that begins by recognizing that students are what? Humans first. So please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Sara Goldrick-Rab, at this time.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you today. I really do wish I could be there in person. I'm glad to see that some of you were able to gather, and I really appreciated the opportunity to get to hear just now about all of the incredible work that you've been doing, and really appreciate the recognition of the humans who do that work. Because we all know that despite impressions out there among the public, it is actually people on a daily basis that make higher education what it is. Now, I know that I'm going to be speaking with you at a particular moment in history. I want to acknowledge that in a moment. But first, I want to just express my goal and intent today, which is to support you as you support Hudson's Real College students. Next slide. Now, this is a particularly challenging moment in history. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Just want to make sure that cueing is working. This is a particularly challenging moment in US history, particularly not only around people's everyday lives, but their lives as it is vis-a-vis higher education. Can you go back one? It looks like one skipped. There we go. Okay, so this is what the world looks like in higher education if you open the newspapers right now, or probably more if you kind of open your phone and start scrolling through newspaper headlines. These are the kinds of things that we teaching and working in higher education have to face every day. Claims that, of course, people are beginning to doubt whether college itself is worth it, even though everything indicates that the only people who really have remained healthier and generally more economically stable through the pandemic are people with college degrees. We're increasingly told that we're experiencing the largest college enrollment declines in ages, often without mentioning that we were already at an all-time high in college enrollment. And we are subject to the expertise of folks like NYU marketing professor Scott Galloway, who has issued yet another prediction about the end of college, indicating that the elite cyborg universities are coming to take us over. Next slide, please. Clearly, despite all of your very hard work and everything that's been going on, nothing is okay. And I think that it's okay to say that and to admit it out loud, to engage in real talk while also talking about how we're going to move forward together and what the real work is. And that, in fact, is the origin of that real college movement, which we began several years ago. Real College takes its name from MTV's Real World. I'm hoping that some of you out there remember that show. I remember it quite fondly from my youth. The tagline for the Real World was, "It's time to stop being polite and start getting real." And that has a purpose. Frankly, cutting the nonsense and getting in a transparent and honest way to the heart of the matter and being honest and open about our feelings is an important part of our struggles to get up every day and continue forward. So it is okay to say nothing is okay. Next slide. Part of what is going on when we say nothing is okay is that people are coming to us, adults from all over, are coming in as students, and they are genuinely eager to learn, but they are meeting with less success. And frankly, many of us, faculty and staff and administrators working in higher education, are feeling the same way too. We're not finding that our work translates into the same outcomes as it used to before the pandemic, that our feelings of isolation and alienation are widespread. That shows in virtually every survey out there. There's a very strong desire for flexibility, which I would argue has been present, especially work flexibility and the flexibility to be at home while working. That's been present in this society for more than 25 years. But we've now been given the opportunity, particularly during the pandemic, and many of us intend to hold on to it. And decisions about what we're able to do, what we're going to prioritize, what matters most to us, what we value, and what we want to do when we get up in the morning, those things are fluctuating. They're volatile. They're changing on a daily basis. And those things, as they enter your classrooms, right, as feelings of what Durkheim, the sociologist, called anomie, when the feelings of a desire for, again, a more flexible space and a more dynamic learning environment, and those feelings of volatility enter the classroom, they either need to be accommodated and adjusted for, or they will get in the way of success. Next slide. What's most important as we recognize these things is everything I just described, all the things that we're feeling and experiencing together. They are not the personal problems of a few people. This is not about individuals who've made bad decisions during a pandemic. There may be such people, they can exist, but the data clearly show that so many groups of people are affected that the causes have to be structural in order for the numbers to be so big. And when we think about the things that are really shaping our lives right now, and particularly the lives of our students, we have to pay attention to 5 major issues. In my book, Paying the Price, I wrote about these as the new economics of college. During the pandemic, all of these things have been radically heightened. And in fact, some of them have become far worse than they were ever in the past. So the first thing that we've got to acknowledge is that America is at a record high level of wealth inequality. And if we're being honest about it, that maps onto race in this country. So people are living very different lives within their homes, not just because they make different amounts of money at work, but because they have different levels of support in their savings accounts, if they even have a savings account. They have varying levels of debt. They have varying ability to cover that debt. Some people on a month-to-month basis during this pandemic actually found themselves saving money because they didn't have to, for example, commute to work. They weren't spending money on lunch at work. Other people found themselves laid off from work. Other people found themselves facing health crises that they didn't have medical insurance for, and they had to empty any account that they had and rack up debt to cover that. Well, in the meantime, others saved on not taking $10,000 a year vacations and are in a better financial position today. all of those things were playing out, and all of those things are affecting how your students are going to be able to afford college this fall. Another really major factor affecting everyone is that the labor market is a mess. There are very few stable work opportunities and very few supportive work opportunities. So when we say that jobs exist, these are not necessarily jobs that pay even a living wage. These are not necessarily jobs that a student, for example, could count on keeping from one semester to the next. Now, I know that your students in particular have always worked. It is not a new thing. The new thing this fall is probably that many of them are unable to get work, or unable to hold the work down because of all that they are juggling, and perhaps because of their health. They are probably going to feel additional levels of uncertainty about whether they are going to be able to maintain the work, especially if they have to make any changes. Now, there are some things that may offset that. So we are seeing some employers who are having trouble finding people and frankly are more willing to be flexible with folks, even giving them additional benefits in order to attract them. But let's remember, the racial and gender dimensions of the labor market are still playing out even in that space. So your students from minoritized communities are far less likely to be offered such perks by their employers. Another major factor that is affecting how things are playing out right now is the inadequacy of the social safety net. You know, this country has said for a very long time that it is important that talent and hard work determine success. And so if something structural is befalling you, we want to make sure that we put a net around you so that your talent and hard work can emerge as the major factor driving your success rather than some sort of happenstance, unlucky accident. But beginning in the 1980s, federal policymakers and state policymakers began systematically dismantling what we used to call the social safety net. And they did so in ways that have profoundly reshaped higher education. So as one example, in the 1970s, if you were receiving cash assistance because you were a low-income mom, education, particularly education beyond high school, was something that was held out as a good thing for you. Beginning with the 1996 welfare reform, it became something you were dissuaded from. In addition, even since that time, we have seen, for example, that if somebody needs access to what we call SNAP, which is formerly what was known as food stamps, we've been told that they must meet work requirements and that college doesn't count as work. During this pandemic, we've seen additional eligibility criteria placed on college students that are not placed on other adults. So, for example, last spring when the pandemic hit, it's hard to believe it's been more than a year, we were told that some of those work requirements for adults would be suspended, except for college students. Now, over the course of the last year, there was a major fight, including on the part of folks like yourselves advocating for students. And in December, we won some major changes. But in the meantime, we went through a period of over 6 months where the needs of college students were really put in a very secondary way, as if they were somehow less deserving. Another major challenge is our very clearly outdated and highly rigid higher ed finance frameworks. So that is something that everybody is struggling to adapt to right now because the pandemic certainly raises the need for multiple different kinds of support. I heard your president speaking, for example, about emergency aid. The flexibility in the funding around emergency aid that we've received during the pandemic is unprecedented in the history of American financial aid. That's a good thing. But we are still struggling with the same old battle between the feds and the states over whose job it is to actually make sure your colleges have resources to operate. And of course, we're doing all of this in the context of a national health emergency. And frankly, that health emergency predated the pandemic because the systematic racial disparities in health that were pre-existing before the pandemic were already a national crisis. So all of these things together are structural problems. And what's so important is that as you are moving through your time teaching, working, etc., that you keep the focus of the discussion about problems on the structure so that we don't make individual people feel like they are alone or they are to blame. Next slide, please. Now, we have some evidence around the challenges that existed before the pandemic, and I'm grateful to all of you at Hudson for the fact that you actually agreed to and submitted to data collection to see how your students were doing even before the pandemic. So in fall 2019, my team had the honor of fielding what we call the Real College Survey, an instrument that we developed over the course of the last decade and that we've now fielded at about 500 colleges and universities. We fielded it at your institution. It's an electronic survey, and I suppose that most of you know what happens to electronic surveys, which is that they tend to be ignored, deleted, missed, not open, not clicked on, etc. And your students did the same thing, as usual with an electronic survey, which is the vast majority didn't answer it. We tend to find that the students who don't answer surveys tend to be worse off than students who do. But the data that we got from the 700 or so students who did take the survey revealed that before the pandemic, more than 2/3 of them were experiencing some form of basic needs insecurity. About half were dealing with food insecurity, which meant that they didn't have regular access to affordable food so they could afford to eat on a daily basis. About 58% were dealing with housing insecurity, which means that in many cases, they're one step away from losing their housing. It's things like not being able to pay their utility bills or their rent on time, living in overcrowded or dangerous conditions. And 14% of your students reported that they had experienced homelessness. In most cases for Hudson students, that's sheltered homelessness taking the form of couch surfing. It's important to note that one of the struggles that we have in this country is the federal government can't agree on what constitutes homelessness. And it has 6 different definitions. But as a matter of just statistical evidence, what I can tell you is whether your students experience any form of homelessness, whether it's sleeping on the street or couch surfing or living in their car, all of them have large negative effects on how the student does in the classroom and whether they're likely to be retained in college. So this was your setting before the pandemic. Next slide. And there were very large disparities. And many of these disparities mirror the disparities that you see in who actually succeeds in transferring, winning awards, graduating, and so on and so forth. So for example, at your institution before the pandemic, there was a 25 percentage point gap in the rates of basic needs insecurity between Black and white students. There was a 17 percentage point gap in the rates of basic needs insecurity such that people with children were much more likely to experience these challenges. And there was a 22 percentage point gap based on whether or not a student self-identifies as LGBTQ. That again speaks to structural challenges. One of the leading reasons that LGBTQ students are more likely to experience basic needs insecurity is that they are more likely to be estranged from family and unable to access that support. In some cases also, they are less likely to find that the services that are offered are appropriate for or welcoming to them. So these are clearly large equity concerns, and I can hear in the opening remarks how much you are attuned to them and concerned about them. Next slide. Now, I want to raise up an additional issue, and that is the COVID-19 virus itself. There's been a lot of discussion of the effects of the pandemic, the isolation, and all of the things I've been talking about so far. And we've all been working really hard to think about how to avoid further infections. But we know very little about how the virus itself, how being infected with COVID-19 might actually play out for your students in the classroom. And I'll be honest, how it might play out for those of you who have also had the infection. In a paper that we just released about 3 weeks ago, that's under review, it's got a revised and resubmitted a major medical journal right now. The Hope Center finds that students who have self-reported being infected with COVID which was 7% of a large national sample of over 100,000 students that we surveyed, that those students who've been infected are 1.4 times more likely to experience anxiety or depression, and 1.7 times more likely to experience food insecurity. Now, what does this mean? It means that when you are teaching this semester and you see a student sleeping, or you see a student with a camera off, there's a new variable potentially at play, a new potential explanation for what's going on. Now, in the past, one of the things that was so important was that we broaden the explanations beyond typical things like students just don't care, students aren't trying, college is not important to them. And that we begin to include things like maybe the student didn't get a good night's sleep because they're taking care of a family member. Maybe the student isn't able to turn on the camera because they're in an environment where they don't want to disclose, where they are. Maybe the student is sleeping because they haven't had a meal. Now we have a new one. Maybe the student is sleeping because they're experiencing long COVID and the resulting fatigue. Maybe the student is experiencing brain fog and is not understanding the questions that you are asking or reading the assignments in the way that you attend. And this raises up a new challenge because, as we know, community colleges have not been given the resources that they need to address students' health. That's been a long-standing problem. And yet, the rates of infection are going to be higher among your students compared to others. So this is a new and really important challenge to attend to. We both want to prevent infections, but we also need to attend to the lasting consequences of infection. Next slide, please. So all of that adds up to one very simple takeaway. And I was introduced with this idea that students are humans first, and here's where I'm going to hit it over and over again. Maslow comes before Bloom. It's so incredibly basic and fundamental that when I tell kindergarten teachers what I talk about every day, they say, you've got to be kidding, because they can't imagine entering a classroom and trying to teach students to read if they haven't had breakfast. But all too often, we have for years been entering classrooms and trying to do learning without not only the attention to these issues, but the support to be able to do something about them. And that's where things really, really do have to change. And they are beginning to change. So what I want to do next is spend a little time talking with you about some things that we can all do on a daily basis, and then some things that we can do together that will take a little bit longer, but will create more structural change. Next slide, please. Okay, I think I already emphasized this. I just want to underline that Students Are Humans First is the most important equity-centered tool that we can use in higher ed going forward. And if I was in a debate with Scott Galloway about the coming cyborgs to higher ed, I would tell him that the number one thing that's coming to higher ed, especially to institutions that will succeed, is a human-centered approach. Colleges have been working to become student-ready, but we have to put the human in that student ready first. Next slide. So, first thing that we all have to do, and this is an ongoing practice. This is not something that you say, oh, I just do that, okay? It takes daily work, and I'll be honest with you, it takes more work when you yourself are exhausted and struggling with your own challenges at home, okay? Seeking to understand, using inquiry with your students to understand what's happening off camera, because it almost always matters, off camera, outside the classroom. Please remember that as you seek to understand, students are coming to the table with good reasons to fear you. They don't just fear faculty, they fear staff and they fear administrators. Many of their initial interactions with an institution are around a system we call financial aid. Financial aid is a small American bureaucratic tragedy. It is the work of a bunch of really good people who have been given an unconscionable level of rules and regulations that they did not create to implement. But the process of seeking and trying to receive financial aid, particularly as a new student, often leads them to fearful of consequences, of not doing a form, of not being able to say things in the right way. The stakes are incredibly high. And so even as we use inquiry to ask them about what's happening with them and how they are, we also have to work to build trust. Next slide. So a couple of things to know, and some of you probably know this, but I really want to emphasize it because it isn't said enough to people who are teaching and interacting with students in higher ed. Did you know these kinds of things? Need-based financial aid. We use this term need, so you think that it's based on a student's income and wealth, not based on their grades. But even need-based financial aid, even the Pell Grant, has academic performance requirements. And those requirements have become increasingly strict. They don't just speak to the grades a student must get, they speak to the pace at which a student completes their courses. So students often find that the daily trade-offs that they have to make are incredibly consequential. Think about the student who comes to you in the middle of the semester not doing well, and the calculus that they're trying to figure out about whether it's best to stay in the class where they're not succeeding, whether they should drop the class. In some cases, they tend to drop the class thinking it's better than getting a bad grade. And in doing so, they have adversely affected their financial aid by dropping to part-time. In other cases, they think, well, let's just proceed and who cares if I get a D, but then they don't realize that overall their GPA is going to fall and it becomes very hard to recover. These folks are not just using those financial aid dollars for themselves. Very few people these days, frankly. Just like when you bring home income, you're not just feeding yourself often, you are supporting a network. Okay? They too are supporting a network of people. And so they're very, very concerned about that loss of flow of income. And that does create a lot of motivation, I have to say. I mean, they're deeply fearful and they want to do well in school. But the problem is actually the system is set up to be so complicated that even those of us with PhDs who spent 20 years studying the system can't always offer the student good advice. Okay? And not making SAP, not meeting these standards, means that you lose all financial aid, all of it, including loans. Okay? So it's a highly punitive system. And this is coloring the interactions that you have with students around academic issues. Next slide. As I said, then part of the solution is to demonstrate trust. And we have to actively demonstrate trust on an ongoing basis. Contrary, again, to some pundits' claims, and contrary to the single study that claimed that students were academically adrift, which was based on a very small sample of American undergraduates, studies show that students very much do want to do the work. There really are a lot of choices for them out there. Low-wage work might not seem good to many of us, but the fact is many of them strongly considered going to work rather than enrolling in school. It's also, when you're faced with this much stress, far easier to stay home and take care of your kids rather than to try to take care of your kids while also going to school. So they've gone through a lot to be there. But oftentimes, the way that courses are constructed or the way that policies affecting the students are constructed seem more intended to weed out bad apple students. And I suspect that most of you know what I'm talking about here. You know, an effort to try to ensure that no one cheats the system, an effort to try to ensure that no one gets unfair advantages. Consider, for example, I'm going to give you an example just from yesterday, actually. I'm teaching this semester, and of course, one of my policies is that it's very important to attend class, and I encourage the students to do so. And yesterday, 30 of my 31 students showed up, but one of them did not. Now, I ended the class, and I opened my email, and I had a note from that student who said to me, "Today is my due date, and I thought that I was in labor." Okay? Now, should I give her any grace here, or is that not fair to the other students? Right? These are the kinds of questions that we oftentimes end up agonizing over, even though, let's be really honest, the fact that she's willing to do the work and trying to take the class, even though she's going to have a newborn, is a pretty good sign. And making adjustments to enable her to do the work doesn't give her unfair advantages over others. In fact, she's starting from way behind because she's going to be doing my whole class all semester with a lot less sleep. Okay? So we have to think about ways to design for inclusive classrooms and inclusive colleges, rather than those that basically operate on assumptions that we should be Darwinian in our approaches, as if weeding people out is making the world a better place. The other thing that's so important about all of this is trust is a big motivator. When you demonstrate to students, especially at the top of the semester, at the beginning, that you trust them and you are a warm demander who expects a lot in return for that trust, it does help adults to become more devoted and committed to the class. Next slide. So one of the other things that can happen when we try to make policies or write syllabi to deal with bad apples is that we end up increasing what's known as administrative burden. So let's think about what administrative burden is. I want you all to consider a recent example, the child tax credit. So the child tax credit is considered a major policy achievement, and it is giving people, perhaps yourselves included, and probably a lot of your students, about $300 a month per child, up to $600 a month. And in order to get it, you have to do several things. The first thing is that you have to know that it exists, okay? That's particularly true if you did not file taxes this past year. Because if you did not file taxes, you have to go to a special website to register to begin to be able to receive the tax credit. But beyond that, once you know that it exists, there's not a lot of administrative burden because the money is simply given to you. There are not compliance requirements, and it's pretty straightforward. Okay? Contrast that, let's say, with many emergency aid programs where students are not sure how to apply. They're not sure if they're eligible. They have to fill out an online or in-person application where they don't know where it is. And then they have to meet a grade requirement to keep the money. You wouldn't believe, by the way, how many colleges are telling students they can't have emergency aid unless they first max out all student loans. Okay, we've got community colleges out there that are saying that. We also have community colleges that are asking students to repay emergency grants, basically turning them into loans a year after receiving them. All of those things are hoops, okay? And whenever you see hoops or red tape, you should immediately assume, because it's almost always true, that this is another driver of inequity. And it's creating work for somebody. It's almost always not just creating work for students, it's creating staff work as well. So rather than focusing on the bad apples, focus on the barrel. If you have a concern that a lot of students in your class are cheating or engaging in plagiarism, consider what it might be that is leading them to do that in the first place. Okay? Sometimes that's about they've never been talked to about the importance of focusing on what they're actually getting and learning rather than grades. In some cases, it's simply because they don't understand what they're doing, and so they're going to try to find the shortest distance between 2 points, which is to cheat. Okay? In some cases, it is not about you, the instructor, or the culture even in your classroom. Frankly, it's about the K-12 environment they came from. And while we can't go back, we're not going to send them backwards to have a new experience. We don't have time machines. We do have the ability to actually just say that out loud and make it a topic of conversation. So, yesterday when I greeted my class for the first time, one of the things that I said to them as I was introducing myself as a teacher is I said, I do some things differently. And one of the things that I do differently is that I don't make assumptions that, whether you're an A, B, or C student based on your GPA coming into my classroom. In fact, I don't believe there are A, B, or C students. I believe that all of you have the power to grow. And whether you were told that in high school or not, right, I'm telling you that now. Now prove me right? Those kinds of things to help them begin to grapple with what might have worked for them or not worked for them in the past. And yes, I see someone in the comment correctly summoning Carol Dweck here. This is a growth mindset exercise. What's important is that we engage in the growth mindset exercise, not just for our students, but for ourselves. All of us are growing. All of you educators, by the very nature of education, means that you believe in learning. Next slide. One practice, and this is not the only practice, but I just want to lift it up, and I don't know where the status is of this conversation at your institution, but there is a practice known as ungrading. I personally learned how to do ungrading from a guy named Jesse Stommel. If you're on Twitter, he's at Jessifer. He does a lot of work through an organization called Digital Pedagogy Lab. And there is now a great book edited by Susan Blum that gives you examples of different professors who have found different ways to move beyond the standard quantitative approach, which again, ABCs, to doing a variety of things in a class, including peer review and self-assessment, to help you understand how students are doing. One of the examples that I use of this is that multiple times during the semester, I ask a student to stop and write a self-reflection where they answer several questions. One of those questions is, what of the material that we've been covering lately, what have you really learned? What's new to you? What are you challenged by? What are you struggling with? To what extent do you feel that you've been able to do the work of the course? Give me examples. What challenges have you faced in doing that work? This is really important because this allows me to work with them to troubleshoot it. And finally, I ask them, if you were being asked to grade yourself, what grade would you give yourself at this point? By doing this multiple times during the semester, they can see their own trajectories and own it. And I'll tell you what, at the end of the semester, I'm still required to give them a grade because I exist in a context in a university that does require it. But there are no more arguments in my classes about what the grades are because they're giving them to themselves, and they are always harder on themselves than I would have been. If anything, the conversations that I tend to have with them are about helping them to see that they've made more progress than they actually realize that they did. This is working better for first-generation, low-income, and minoritized students than it is for students who are coming from places of privilege. And that is largely, it seems, because people coming from places of privilege did really well in grade-based systems in high school and think that it was essential to their success. For those students, what I tell them is that I want them just to consider how they will succeed in a job or a family environment where grades are not given for success. Next slide. Okay. The other really powerful thing that we can all do on a daily basis is help bridge the gap between students and their needs and resources. And I can't say enough how important this is. The data are very, very clear that this is a problem. Next slide. What I'm going to show you here are some data from our latest national survey. This is from last fall. We have data from over 200,000 students around the country. We're comparing the need of the students, their basic needs and security, to their use of key supports. The first thing that we saw was that among students who were facing basic needs and security, only 18% of them were accessing SNAP. SNAP is the best and most important program for people dealing with food insecurity because it allows them to be able to lower the price of their food wherever they want to shop. Okay, at any place that takes EBT, they can shop. That's a very different thing than allowing them to go to a food pantry where they have to rely on donations, they have limited choice, and they can only get their food on campus. Now, two-year college students were more likely, but still not likely, to receive SNAP benefits. So it was about 25% or so for the two-year college students and lower for the four-year college students. Another really important problem is that only about a third of students in crisis last fall applied for emergency aid. Only about a third. That's incredibly low. And one of the leading reasons that they did not apply is they simply didn't know the programs existed. The second leading reason is they thought that somebody else deserved it more, and they were afraid that if they got it, somebody else wouldn't get it. I will say that's much more common for white students. Minoritized students are much more likely to simply not know about the program or not know how to apply. And the populations that we are the most concerned about, who seem the most disconnected from college, particularly Black male students, are the least likely to get support, even though they are the most likely to have the need for the support. Okay, this is a tangible thing that we can all work on together. We are not asking, that every college simply end food insecurity on their campus. That's not something a college can do by itself. And frankly, some colleges simply do it by putting up more gates, right? Making it hard to get in. But what we can do is say that if a student has a challenge like this, we can at least ensure they know about the supports, they've been welcomed into those supports, and they are connected. Next slide. Connecting students to things like emergency aid works, okay? I have been working on this as a researcher for 20 years, and during the pandemic, we got some really interesting evidence from one of your peers, Compton College. At Compton College last spring, they used an app that you heard about in my bio, Equity. This is an app that I created, and that we're able to rigorously evaluate using comparison groups the impact of. And Compton started using this app to distribute their emergency aid last May. We then compared the effect for the students, these are comparable groups, students who were not awarded the emergency aid to students who were awarded the emergency aid by August. Okay, so this is just May to August last year during the pandemic. It doubled the graduation rate. And here's the thing. Here's what they got. They got $250 delivered fast. The Equity app delivers support within 48 hours. And it's easy to access. It takes students an average of 10 minutes or less to complete. So what this says to me is that emergency aid, when done in a human-centered way, can be very, very effective. Next slide. Now, one of the ways that you can help students to know about these supports is to put the information on the syllabus. I have heard forever about how students don't read the syllabus, but over the last several years, as I've been advancing this idea around a syllabus statement, I've learned they do read the syllabus. So for example, in my own institution, 10 of us put this on the syllabus, and within weeks, we had increased by 50% visits to the student support staff for these issues, okay? And that was just with 10 professors across a large university. Students are clearly reading the syllabus for the information that they are actually seeking. We have a resource guide on our website, and I'll post the website at the end, that explains all the different ways to put this onto your syllabus and the wording that you could craft. And the great thing about your institution is that you have a very clean and clear place to direct them. So the language here says, go see the Dean of Students. In your case, you could direct them towards Hudson Helps, okay? And this is especially important to remind students about because there's new help available this year. So as I noted, the child tax credit is available. SNAP is easier to access than it has ever been, and it's so important that that happens. And the HERF $3 that were delivered through the ARP to your institution are emergency aid dollars that frankly the students need and you need to spend promptly if you want the federal government to step up and provide more. So we have every reason to center this kind of information everywhere that you possibly can, including the syllabus. Next slide. Another thing that you can do, and that speaks to what I noted earlier about using inquiry with your students, is to do some quick surveys. I do a welcome survey. I do another survey as a sort of refresh about a month later, and I do another one a month later. I do it periodically. I make sure that they know that these are confidential, that I don't share them with anybody, but I just ask a small set of questions and they share information. And then when I'm having an issue with a student, whether it's actually a good or a bad thing, I return and look at their survey answers real quick to see if there's anything that I can use in that conversation. So for example, if a student missed an assignment and they answered this question, what challenges are you currently facing, by saying, well, I've got 2 kids at home and I'm not sending them to school right now, then I say, dear so-and-so, I noticed you didn't turn in this assignment. I recognize from your survey that you've been upfront about your challenges with the kids, okay? So can you tell me more about whether that's what's happening here? And do you have recommendations for how we can work together to help you complete that assignment, right? Those kinds of things. Just by the adding the recognition of whatever it is that they told you on the survey, it increases their likelihood of actually engaging with your outreach to them. Next slide. The other thing you can do is strategic emails. And there was a randomized control trial that was recently published by researchers at UC Davis that showed how well this works. So they had professors send very short notes to students, not because there was trouble, but rather to simply affirm their progress. So the note said things like, dear Sarah, we're in the 3rd week of class and I want you to know I see you. I've seen you showing up. I see you doing your assignments. You're doing great. If you run into trouble this semester, please come see me. Also, by the way, did you know that if you're having trouble affording groceries, that SNAP is available? Hope you're doing well. Okay. Now, it's really important that this not be sent out as a generic message to all your students. This does have to start with dear Sarah, not dear student. But you can, and I recognize your time, and I recognize that many of you have large classes. I get it. But spending a little bit of time doing this is going to give you more engaged people in your classroom and reduce the amount of haggling and other sorts of nonsense that take up your time, especially towards the end of a term. Next slide. Now, I want to talk for just a moment about addressing the structural challenges together. Advocacy is incredibly important at this moment. Not only do we have a Congress that has shown some willingness to rethink the ways that we typically do higher education policy, but we also have a Secretary of Education and an Undersecretary of Education, since we've just learned that James Quall is hopefully going to be seated by the middle of September. He should have been seated about 4 months ago, but he's finally going to be seated. We have folks there who really understand and appreciate the work that is happening at community colleges. And of course, that includes First Professor Dr. Biden. So this is the moment to be telling the story of the work that your college is doing, the work that you're doing, and the work that your students are doing, and to make concrete asks. Throughout the pandemic, when stimulus payments came out, for the first several payments, students were excluded. Not entirely, but largely, particularly if they were dependent students. They were told, well, your parents got the check and they should share it with you. Who are we kidding? Okay. We did succeed in getting that adjusted for the last stimulus payment. And if there do continue to be stimulus payments, for example, due to the Delta variant, we need to ensure that our students continue to be included. We have to avoid a HERF cliff, which is to say there's been a lot of money coming in for things like emergency aid. We don't want that support to suddenly go away because frankly, the effects of the pandemic are not going to magically disappear in a year or 2. There is a bill pending from Tina Smith of Minnesota to make emergency aid a permanent part of higher education funding from Washington, D.C. There are also a number of bills in states, not in New Jersey so far, but there really should be, around the country to add state emergency aid programs, okay? This builds on the standard state grant programs, but critically, it's a supplement that is far more flexible. We need to continue to make it easier for students to get SNAP. There are multiple bills, again, that are pending to address that. You could pick your favorite senator. They pretty much, everybody from Warren to Schatz and others have bills on this. We need to continue the road of pushing for the legislation that will expand support services at community colleges and improve teacher working conditions. And I urge you to emphasize, as we advocate for improved teacher working conditions, the teacher working conditions are student learning conditions. period and full stop. There cannot be legislation focused on student success that does not work on ensuring the security of the faculty who must be in the room with the students. Okay. And there is an effort, as you all know, to make public higher education free, starting with the nation's community colleges. I believe that the most important part of that effort is actually in the message that it sends, to recognize that the public has spoken. Some education beyond high school is essential. That doesn't always mean a bachelor's degree. It doesn't always mean a master's degree, but it means at least a couple of years. And if it is essential, then we need to remove the tuition barrier. The other really important part of that is to increase the number of people in this country who are invested in ensuring that public higher education has the resources that it needs to do well. When the middle class becomes more and more interested in community colleges stand a better chance of having stable funding. This has been shown time and again through research. So this movement is about a number of different related issues, but as you can see here, it's not nearly as simple as just doubling the Pell Grant. Okay? We need your advocacy to address students as human beings through multiple supportive policies. And I believe that's my last slide, and I'm going to have a chance to take questions for about 15 minutes. If you can go to the next slide, I think it's just our website. Thank you. There we go. So our website has the resources that I discussed today. You can find them under the term resources on the website. You can sign up for our newsletter. We issue a newsletter every other week. We do not spam you, and we give you access to a lot of free resources. We are holding monthly learning sessions right now completely for free on important topics and giving you all the latest science as well as the latest advances in policy to help you advocate for change. Again, I'm so grateful to be invited today, and I'm interested in taking some questions if you want to put them in the chat. Okay. All right, I'm looking at the chat. I appreciate all the thank yous. Does anyone have a question?
Can you hear me?
I can.
So yes, so we do have the ability to have people who are in person to also ask questions as well.
Great.
Those in the chat area. So right now we have someone at the North Hudson campus. If you have someone there who has a question, and also if there's anyone here in Journal Square, if you have a question, let us know. Raise your hand and we'll bring you a mic. Raise your hand, we'll bring you a mic if you have a question. And if you are in the banquet room on the first floor, if you have a question, please let Anthony know.
Okay, while you're working on that, I see I do have a question.
Working on that.
Eric. It says, when you think of class sizes, do you have an ideal number or a size that you prefer? To be honest with you, Eric, I don't. I think that it is more about what the resources are that I have that correspond to the size of the class. Okay, so for example, if I'm going to teach a large class, I do need some assistance in order to support the students. And typically I tend to do something like a 1:40 or so ratio. That's what I've become fairly used to, so that I have someone not to monitor the students, to be able to do those caring and check-in emails with them. In a larger class, I also think it is incredibly important to lean heavily into different engagement techniques and to avoid standing at front and lecturing, to use flipped classrooms and those sorts of things. But I have had just as much success implementing caring strategies in large classes as I have in very small ones. In fact, I think that sometimes when I have very small classes, like 10 students at a time, you know, one thing, it's nice to give them personal attention, but the one thing that's lost is there's not as big a variety in human experience. And I really try to take all the humans in the classroom and use the differences among them, the different perspectives that they have, the different walks of life that they come from, et cetera, in order to enrich the class discussion. And so when you have a smaller number of people, I often feel like that sometimes doesn't happen as much, and I have to work twice as hard to kind of bring that in. Angela asks, in what ways do you think students with disabilities might be served better to ensure their retention? Well, I think, to be really honest with you, that a lot of the things I talked today about would have disproportionate benefit for students with disabilities. And I would argue that the movement to support students with, who are differently abled, including universal design, have real implications for the rest of us. So, I'm often trying to explain why I don't necessarily want us to spend too much time making services on our campus that students have to meet special criteria for, but rather doing whatever we can to simply provide it openly to everyone. The best example that I would say right now is actually around how we feed students. So I've been so pleased this year to see at least 2 community colleges that have decided to start offering universal breakfast. And I believe they're using their HERF dollars to do that. And one of the reasons I'm so glad about that is that the universal breakfast in K-12 education is being shown to do much better in terms of engaging and supporting students than the kind of breakfast program where you have to sign up for it. In fact, the most recent studies are showing that not only do more people get fed with universal breakfast, more of the most disadvantaged people get fed, and there's a greater likelihood of the whole student body feeling like the school cares about them. That doesn't seem to happen with targeted programs. It seems to happen with universal programs. So, I think that that's a really important strategy. Let's see. Sharon asks, some of what students will share with you might be sensitive and personal. How do you ensure your assistants don't share your students' information? By training them. That's the answer. I treat anybody who works with me as an assistant as literally a colleague and a partner in teaching. And, just like anybody who coaches college students should be themselves coached, anybody who does therapy for anybody should themselves have a therapist. These teaching assistants also need someone to speak with them about those things, and I hold them accountable for that. I've never had a problem in 20 years. I've never found that anybody who's trying to learn how to become an educator, if given proper expectations and information upfront and transparency, violates that. These things tend to happen when we don't explain upfront what it really means to keep a student's information confidential, right? So that it really means not discussing the student in any sort of public space, that it really means that you can't share the information with your friend or your roommate, those kinds of things. But we all learn that stuff and hopefully get professional development to be reminded of the rules, and we need to keep refreshing it. Mohammed asked, do I check my grade with a self-grade of students? Let me flip that question a little bit. Do I look at their own self-grades and compare them with my own notes on what I've been able to observe and what the students have been telling me about their own work all semester? Yes. So I'll give you an example. If a student says to me at the end of the term, I deserve an A, I did everything I could, but in their second self-reflection said, I have not been doing the work lately, and frankly, I've lost motivation, then I'll return to them and say, talk to me about that reflection and how you think about that reflection in light of your assessment that you deserve an A. Sometimes, and more often than not, frankly, when confronted with evidence like that, they'll go, oh, I forgot about that. I really didn't do A work all term. Or some of them would say, you know what, to be honest with you, I'm looking at my growth over time and I did a major correction following that. And Mohammed, I would love it if you would email me a study that suggests that 25% of students overrate themselves. I tend to find that it's much lower, that it is actually only a handful of students that overrate themselves, but that very substantial numbers, especially of women students, tend to underrate themselves. But I think this is something that, we do need to continue to look at evidence on, and to look at patterns, and also to look at whether this is context specific, right? So this also can depend on the culture that you're creating in the classroom. And so we might find classroom specific variation in the extent to which students who, for example, feel afraid to say to you that I did C+ work this semester because they'll be embarrassed in front of you or think that you will shame them might be more likely to tell you falsely that they did A work. So these are the kinds of things that we just need to continue to interrogate. But yes, please do send me studies. I want to offer a chance to anybody who's in person who might have questions. For the team there.
Sure. Hi, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I once read one of your, sorry, Lisa's directing me. I don't know where I'm supposed to stand. I face this way. Okay, sorry. I once read one of your articles on student success at community colleges, and you talked about how professors are often very limited with their time because they don't have the time off that professors at four-year universities have for doing professional development. And you also mentioned how one-off seminars for professional development are pretty ineffective. So I'm just wondering what you've seen as some of the best practices for community college faculty to engage in meaningful professional development. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. It's something I've been giving a lot of thought to. I increasingly feel like my team has an obligation to not just insist that it happen, but try to create the structural conditions for it to happen. So the first thing is that when I spoke earlier about policy change that resources community colleges, PD has to be at the front and center of that. You all exist in a work environment that is ever changing. If you were a business, they'd be giving you ongoing PD because it's good for business. You need it too. And it's not a deficit-based thing, it's an asset-based thing. You deserve to be invested in. That said, it's not even just that faculty don't learn well in one-off sessions. Adults don't tend to. But that said, what adults tend to need for their own development is engaging, provocative, and ongoing types of learning, okay? So we've been trying to develop this in multiple ways. One of the things that we're doing now is building an online learning platform where you could go on and spend just 20 minutes of your day and be exposed to the latest research or new ideas. Another big thing that adults all need is to learn together in community and to be able to talk to one another and bounce ideas off one another. And that's an important part of being a learning organization, is creating the space for that to happen. So that's another really important point. And I think that, you know, the extent to which peers, your colleagues, can be enlisted to teach each other about some practices that you're using in your classrooms, for example, or, you know, staff, what programs you're implementing so that you can get to know one another, that's also important. I also think that we have to do more around wellness. You know, I think that we're in a difficult spot. There is so much work to be done, but once in a while, releasing faculty from some sort of obligation, even for a short period of time, can pay some big dividends. So, you know, one example can be that you could declare a month of no meetings, right? No mandatory meetings. My medical school just did that, and it was a big, big achievement. And frankly, it resulted in greater productivity. People really did actually do their work, and they felt less drained. You can do the same thing around Zoom, insisting that you have days where you're not on Zoom. Another thing that's really important is to humanize your faculty with your students. So really to talk about and highlight the people who work at the institution. And I don't just mean their degrees, right? They need to know that you have a faculty comprised of people who have families, who are involved in the community, and many of whom have actively and fully chosen to teach at your institutions, that it's not some sort of default from lack of being able to teach at Harvard, okay? They need to hear more about that. When students hear those things, they feel more connected to you, your jobs get easier. And so I think that some of that starts with leadership. So these are all big challenges, though, and I suspect that many of you have better ideas even than I have had just now. What I really want you to do is to be very vocal about advancing them, especially in the national conversation. You know, if there's a specific good PD program that you think should be funded, when we're talking about investing in community colleges, right now we're talking about a lot of specific community college student programs like ASAP and others that should be funded. We could start to name PD examples. Okay, I think I have time for one more. And I love this question from Sara. Thank you so much for asking about non-faculty support services staff, like those in libraries and tutoring. What can they do? Oh, I have to say that librarians have been absolutely essential to the Real College movement, and in fact have been leading voices in saying that this is an issue that they've seen for many, many years that's gone ignored. I think that, you know, honestly, they're often on the front lines of seeing students who are sleeping and so on. Whenever there are basic needs efforts, whenever there are task forces, these individuals should be appointed to those task forces. So should someone from the custodial staff, so should someone from counsel's office, right? This is an institution-wide effort. And anyone who has eyes and ears and close contact with students needs to be regularly giving feedback and weighing in on suggestions. So I think there's a lot to be done. I think libraries and tutoring centers, et cetera, are also places to put this basic needs information and to help establish, again, that culture of care that I know that you all are working so hard on. That is an act, a culture of caring. It's not just a thing, it's a verb. You have to continue to work on it and to grow it and to maintain it and to sustain it. And I know how hard it is to be doing that right now. So as we close out, I just want to thank all of you.
We have one final question, if you don't mind, Dr.
Okay.
Goldrick-Rab, which is
Sure.
one final question.
No
Thank you.
problem. Go for it.
I have one question. I know in our college, we have a culture of care as well. And as instructor, I feel like sometimes students, they don't give us the feedback or like fill in the survey. So is there any incentives to engage all students for the participation? Do you have any like strategy?
Yeah, you know, to be honest with you, incentives have not been working. And I think that what does work is helping the students know why they're doing it. What action will result from them providing that information? The number one thing that they say is they feel that they provide data and it doesn't lead to change. I think we all have experienced that. So being really clear up front, here is what we plan to do. So I say to the students, before I give them the survey, I say, here's how I use this information. You need to help me help you. I cannot help you without this information. I have never had a problem. Students, 100% of my students complete those surveys and they do it on time. I think generally when students get surveys from their colleges overall, they tend to feel like I have answered these before and it has led to nothing. So it is important to say up front what it's for, and it's also important to close the loop on the back end and release the results with the tangible actions that have followed. And that creates a culture where people do feel like giving feedback is actually valuable.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
That's a great-
I appreciate all of
Thank
you
you.
and all of your hard work, and I hope you have a great semester. Do the very best you can, and please hang in there. We're rooting for you.
Well, thank you again for this warm applause. Thank you, Dr. Sara Goldrick-Rab. And we would definitely invite you back at other times to continue the discussion of these very important topics that you brought up today. And we hope that you have a wonderful day and a great semester coming up as well.